Part 2, entitled Meritocracy is the Justification for Unfairness and Inequality. As I said in Part 1, it took Western capitalism about 600 years to go from being a niche activity by freemen in Britain to a global phenomenon that swept away all in its path and forced those who objected to its principles of contracts arranged on consent-based choice to accept this shocking liberalising new reality, and the cultural challenges that go along with it, such as intentional poverty and starvation, or notions of legal, if not actual, equality and individual rights. The West has a declining population but an expanding unemployed industrial workforce, and yet there are no demands for greater economic justice for all, or calls for an end to economic and political exploitation. Socialism, even socialism's left wing, has accepted Blair's third way, and whilst once shouting about economic and class-based social injustice, now screeches about causes that are perverse to all but an idling, underemployed middle class who've benefited personally from the new third way economic model. They thus see revolution not in economic terms, but in identity and environmental terms, the woke as they've been described. Such a development was predicted by Friedrich Engels as far back as 1890, when he said in a letter to Otto von Bonegg that the cause of German workers was beset by problems caused by its educated middle classes. This is what he said: "The arrogant pontifical presumptions of our so-called educated men seems to me a far greater obstacle to the interests of working people. We are still short of technicians, agronomists, engineers, chemists, architects, etc. But apart from specialists like these, we shall manage very well without the rest of the educated men, e.g. the present heavy influx of literati and students into the party will be attended by all manner of mischief, unless those gentry are kept within bounds." What Engels was observing was that the educated men and students, whilst not the exploiting middle class or bourgeoisie, will acquire more power than the actual workers, and thus may begin to attain a class identity in their own right, and thus focus on their class preoccupations within the Communist Party and eventually society at large. Before there can be any kind of revolution, as we observed with the middle-class English Civil War, a class identity is required to galvanise people into collective action. That action is political, but is based on collective economic necessity. The middle classes in the late 19th century, with their middle-class education, were seen by Engels as a threat to the interests of the working class. Today, Engels' gentry are the public servants who manage the state, and wokery has replaced nationalism and fascism as our 21st century mischief. Today, people observe the banks financing the country, with the powerful civil service running the country, all sanctioned by weak politicians. People are concerned that the real interests of the economy and society are not being properly addressed. Applying Engels' observation to the present day, it seems likely that our elite state sector, executive head teachers, mandarins in the civil service, council chief executives, and others of similar rank in subsidised industries and corporate charities, have a vested interest in not doing what's in the interest of the working class, namely shrinking the state to cut taxes and give more political and economic power to ordinary people, so they can grow the economy properly and sustainably. Our elite state and banking sectors are too interested in promoting what is in their personal and collective class interests, namely to go on growing the state and financing it with eye-watering levels of debt. We've examined contract, choice and consent and observed they were legal principles that galvanised the consciousness of the middle classes prior to their revolution of the 17th century. So today's general acceptance of state interference based on identity and environmental neurosis becomes the class consciousness that defines this new but ultimately dangerous state class. Today, stop oil protesters and woke identity activists, plus a hodgepodge of other middle-class troublemakers spouting social justice shibboleths, disrupt the lives of ordinary working people. They have become a class conscious of themselves and their class interests, which are at the expense of the freedom of working people to say and believe what they like. An obsession with identity becomes the language of inclusion into the state class. So this class displays the arrogant and pontifical attitudes observed by Engels in 1890, and who believe that they are on the side of the people when they are really acting in their own interests. Such is the nature of class that once class consciousness is achieved, it is difficult for people within that class to see let alone promote anyone's interests other than their own. Demands to extend the state, to create new laws or to restrict freedom fit in nicely with the expectations of a middle class indifferent to the demise of profitable capitalism, but using the state to compensate for their loss of status and opportunity. It's no surprise that when capitalism fails, the middle classes generally become more authoritarian and start clamping down on freedom. It's all about livelihoods, specifically their own. They intentionally add a further layer of misery and stress to the lives and thoughts of ordinary working people who are anxious about their status and opportunity, but do not possess the levers of power or have any understanding of their collective class interests to do anything about it. The new state-created middle class is clear about who should be the nation's winners and losers, and it's not the indigenous working class. To ensure they can maintain the system and secure their status, they promote, amongst other things, mass immigration and debt, while using data to salami slice once properly funded public services to an unacceptable extent. There was a time when public services were delivered on behalf of the people on a demand-led basis. If you needed 10 police officers, you got 10 police officers. Now public services are simply the end point in a supply chain, replicating the free market's approach to product and service delivery. The supply of public services is preoccupied with how those services are managed and at what cost. That, along with maintaining a good reputation for the organisation, has become a near obsession for managerial activity. Meeting the full demand of a service like health is no longer the focus of public service management. It's the rationing of that supply within a framework of managed budgets, performance and accountability, and of course to maintain the reputation of the organisation itself. Ask anyone confident enough to speak up, and they will describe a public organisation or workplace reliant on the smoke and mirrors of data to create the illusion of efficiency and effectiveness. Managers, who cost thousands to employ, spend unproductive time analysing the consequences of staff hitting targets while not gaining the outcomes desired by service users and taxpayers. It's a model of service delivery set up to accommodate the professional aspirations of an entitled modern public sector middle class, rather than to meet the needs of the general public who pay for it. The consequence of state, private business, banking and free market collaboration, plus wokery, activism and in the public sector workplace, accountability becoming toxically micromanaged, is allowing near universal inequality to thrive. It is destroying the lives of actual workers trapped in the system. Unlike the left-wing activist or public sector leader, actual workers are increasingly frustrated with the growing sense of mental and moral alienation. They struggle to make sense of what has happened to them and their class and communities within the living memory of just one generation, and are constantly annoyed by the refusal of their so-called leaders and politicians to give straight answers to fairly obvious questions. To begin to grasp what a new Western reality means for the West, including Britain and its ordinary citizens, we must understand what the now industrially depleted Western workforce does when its consciousness expects personal success based on freedom and consent-based choice and contract, but the economy comprises little more than government, banking, markets and a service sector, with the opium of consumption and consumerism for many the only thing giving purpose to life. Increasingly, the lower skilled indigenous and often unemployed workforce is having to endure growing physical isolation and welfare dependence, having recently been outperformed at home by low-skilled workers from elsewhere in Europe, and in the long term facing an increasing threat from AI and technology in general. Indigenous, unemployed and unskilled workers are increasingly becoming a broken class of the sick and idling poor. The reasons are simple. The economy needs plentiful supplies of cheap and enthusiastic unskilled labour. This, however, puts the indigenous population of workers at best on the economic and opportunities subbench. In addition, the inherited economic and social expectations of the children of the post-war British working class, the children of the so-called boomers, are far too unrealistic for governments and/or a service-led economy to afford. By the 1990s, at the time when the markets and banking system were, with the consent of politicians, taking over the economy, it was clear to business and to government that a new class of workers was urgently needed to supplement the indigenous ones, workers with much lower expectations than their British contemporaries. The British working class reality of the 1950s to 1980s of a good job, fulfilling life and affordable home, complete with a family, has given way to houses of multiple occupation, sometimes but not always accompanied by poor standards of living, loneliness and even maybe a dependency or two. Blair was in the vanguard of this pro-business revolution, another element of his third way. The media laugh at Billy No Mate's British workers, blaming them for their sadness, but it's no joke for the people affected, and it's been created by the sick British economy and its indifferent but enriched economically and politically powerful elite. The public housing, which underpinned the quality of life for many British workers in the past, has been put into the hands of the bankers by governments, unable to work out how to fix the declining British economy. However, the prevalence of increasingly high levels of government and personal debt, which is underpinned in large measure by the notional security of inflated asset price values, most notably housing, has become another feature of Blair's third way economic strategy. It may have been unforeseen in the era of low interest rates and low inflation, but the rise in house prices has simply depleted spending power, taking money out of people's pockets and giving it to the bankers. The result is a general unhappiness with too many examples of deep personal despair. Workers trapped into a life of high costs and low spending power, a very traditional form of exploitation, reflecting the reality that a worker's labour power has always been a mere commodity to be bought as required by the market. Commodifying people's labour power has been going on since people traded their labour in exchange for a wage. In the past, workers were exploited in the Marxist sense by being one factor of production within a system which included factories and profits. For their role in making goods, workers were in capitalism's early days grossly underpaid for their efforts. But by the 1950s, workers were doing better. Today, this model of an affluent manufacturing labour force has been supplanted by a model in which Western workers are, as we said earlier, merely poorly paid parts of a supply chain. The need for profitability has been matched by concepts like efficiency and added value, and just like in the public sector, concerns about reputation and being socially responsible provide the credentials which now match profitability as business preoccupations. This general employment model, spanning public as well as private sectors, however, imposes worse mental or psychological pressure on workers, but particularly public sector workers, who only a generation ago provided a needed public service but are now scrutinised under the aegis of accountability frameworks and performance targets. It's no wonder that with the legacy of a fairly generous welfare system, people are abandoning their workstations either by taking early retirement or simply going off sick. In the private sector, the boredom of old-fashioned work has given way to the stress of the modern workplace. The aim of the so-called accountability model was to create a new public sector meritocracy that would be interchangeable with the private sectors. What it has also done, however, is devalue public service at the delivery end of public organisations, whilst allowing for the few a self-aggrandising belief that they, as managers, or as they style themselves, leaders, are too talented to do the grunt work. For young people entering the workplace, the problem is even more acute. Burdened with the expectations of success by parents and grandparents, and all too often armed with that pointless but expensive degree, the option to look at the modern workplace, not as a place of service, but of stress and wage slavery, is delivering a mental health crisis, or for some, a refusal to enter the workplace altogether. The solution is to try and persuade young people that they can do it. The question is, why would they want to? They stand little chance of getting the fabled starter home, face a working life of being performance measured and evaluated, which causes them overwork and anxiety of a sort that has not been seen since the 16-hour working day. So how does a modern economy deal with escalating numbers of its economic and social casualties? Well, at the moment, it medicates them. The traditional left have become habitually angry at the injustices of the world, but not seemingly its economic system and the human casualties that fall from that. The traditional right are angry too. Unlike the left, who now largely operate the levers of the state in their own self-interest, the right see economic salvation in a house-building programme to reduce the cost of housing so their offspring can get on the housing ladder and start the process of doing well. This middle-class ambition is in lockstep with the demands of the economy and banking system too, so again it feels like common sense. Housing, however, is not supply-side elastic. Prices literally can't go down due to increased supply. House prices go down because demand is choked off by high interest rates and or low wages. For the young indebted graduate, it's a lose-lose again situation. Rental homes or sharing with friends or living with mum and dad remain the options at least until granny passes and there may be some cash floating about. That of course assumes that the banking system hasn't conned her into equity release first. However, more housing is needed to add to the asset registers of the banking system, and these house prices can't go down. The need for house price inflation ties in with the issue of immigration and the creation of an indebted, low-wage working class. More housing will not address house price values as the traditional right believe. It will simply mean starter homes become more and more expensive, with fewer and fewer first-time buyers and more investors buying up and renting out properties on out-of-town new build estates for an expanding population of the newly arrived. Some with money, some with cheap labour power, and some so-called ninjas, people with no income and no job. The consequences of relying on housing as the basis for an economy and the reduction of housing entitlement for the indigenous working class is therefore a trend linked to uncontrolled migration. Not only do we have hundreds or thousands of new builds on the market to buy and rent out, but we also have a baby boomer generation of homeowners slowly dying off and drip feeding housing onto a market with a naturally declining indigenous population. The idea that anyone wants to cut net migration goes against the grain of all the relevant economic indicators. However, who comes here is very important, socially and economically. From a Marxist perspective, labour power, the commodity a worker freely sells to the employer in exchange for a contracted wage, can come from anywhere. As I said earlier, labour power is a commodity. The capitalist system, as opposed to individual capitalists, didn't exploit principally on the basis of race. Capitalism was about exploitation for profit, not racism. So Marxism too is generally indifferent to the skin colour of the exploited worker. Within a Marxist critique, you're either an exploiter or you're exploited. What's critical in Marxism, therefore, is the nature of the exploitation being inflicted on the working person, as this is what shapes their consciousness. To qualify as a proletarian, in other words, a Western worker, within a capitalist system, you need a worker's consciousness, as opposed to, say, a slave or a serf's consciousness. You need to understand not only your own disadvantage as a worker, but the wider disadvantages of your class, how your class is exposed to unfairness, inequality and elitism, and by whom, and what you and your class need to do to address it should also be something you're aware of. There are therefore certain attendant characteristics which some of the modern political left and even the political right seem to ignore in their clamour to accept all identities, ideologies and ethical systems as equal, particularly if they oppose capitalist principles, which must of course include freedom, as it is based on consent and choice. Two principles many cultures openly reject. To qualify as a worker, therefore, with a worker's consciousness, a person should understand the economic nature of inequality and want to minimise it. They should also be able and willing to operate confidently within a free market, but with an understanding of how the market itself is rigged against the interests of the worker. However, to counterbalance those negatives, they must also understand the importance of freedom and the role capitalist principles of contract, choice and consent have contributed to the freedom that they, as part of their Western culture, have come to enjoy over the preceding 200 or 300 years. Freedoms such as contracting on the basis of personal consent and choice in all personal decision making, and that in a mature Western economy, these rights must be enjoyed by everyone, irrespective of sex, race or ethnicity. For this kind of enlightened worker, the what needs to change, therefore, is the unfairness, inequality and elitism inherent within the system, not the existence of an individual's rights. The problem for many on the traditional left, however, is that all too often their client identity groups do not share a belief or even understand individual rights. They might see, for example, coercion and control as normal behaviour between weak and strong individuals, or believe religious group identity with its inherent sexism is more important than individual rights. The result is that women's equality is routinely ignored, or with religious justification, homosexuality is decried and casually described as an abomination. There are cultures in the world from which many who locate to the West have come, where homophobia, racism and sexism is still prevalent and seen by many as their common sense, but it goes unchallenged. Rather than challenge these absurd views, which predate capitalism's development of personal freedom and rights, many misguided people in the West continue to give skin colour its own moral status, having all but forgotten about sex and class as the main causes of disadvantage. Disadvantage that exists today in far too many newly arrived communities of all ethnic backgrounds. For many of the so-called woke, it's a personal impossibility to challenge discriminatory attitudes if those attitudes are held by people of a different ethnic background. A new fear of being seen as racist or culturally insensitive overwhelms them psychologically. The paradox is that by being preoccupied with tolerance for all beliefs, including religious belief, intolerance of liberal values goes unchallenged. For example, women's equality and gay rights are frequently ignored if the proponent is from an ethnic or ethically different background. Being unable to distinguish between unacceptable views about someone based on their skin colour and legitimate criticism about their personal belief system, irrespective of their skin colour, leads you towards overlooking the growth in the kind of lawless, gang and religious-based violence seen in all sorts of places in the world, including the West. Arguably, a combination of naivety and indifference to certain forms of cultural normality is taking the West backwards, and it has started in the inner cities. When the state is absent from closed communities, as it often is out of choice because it has to ration its services, people can't see the unfairness and inequality practiced against women and many minorities within the communities of its newly arrived. Western values, therefore, give way to values that predate the freedoms until recently enjoyed by all in the West.